pull that up. So kind of what we're seeing here, again, to see the scene is we have somebody doing 19-channel neurofeedback. They're flying a plane with their brain. And in this case, I'm doing, as I always do in the clinic, when we're doing neurofeedback, we're also doing 10-channel biofeedback. So we're monitoring the biometrics at the same time we're monitoring the EEG. In this setup, we're actually training on neurofeedback and just monitoring on biofeedback. So this person, a little bit of their story is...
Let me just interrupt you for a quick sec. So just so people can get a visual of this. So there's a woman sitting in a chair with a cap on, and the cap has EEG leads attached to her head. She's looking at a TV monitor ahead of her, and on the monitor is an airplane that's flying, and she's putting her brain into a place of concentration, just kind of a place of, it's almost a meditative state to some extent, but kind of putting her brain into that space that enables the plane to keep elevated and keep flying over different obstacles and things like that as they come along. And then behind her are a number of screens that have her full-blown EEG and some other biometrics, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So, yeah.
Yep, great. Thank you for that. So again, in her case, we 55-year-old woman, 30 years of chronic depression, has done therapy, has done medications, all at scale, has tried every intervention. Eventually, we came up on her list of things to try. And I will say, much to her credit is as little success she's had at escaping this chronic depression, she has continued to try. And that is obviously, that's the most important thing for people who haven't yet been successful, is that they don't give up hope.
And no, I mean, God bless her, right? I mean, that's a difficult road to go down. So.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And so she came in, we presumed, neurofeedback and neurostimulation for chronic depression. That was the workup. That's the path we headed down. We weren't seeing the kind of results that our clinical findings would typically tell us we should see. We should see more change over the series of sessions she was having. That led us to kind of go back, reinvestigate her case, and then kind of come back in with some different approaches. And that was adding in the biofeedback to see what her autonomic nervous system was up, because maybe the problem wasn't living in her central nervous system, but was living in her autonomics. And sure enough, that's what we found. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. So here on the screen, what we're seeing is kind of heart rate variability, which is very high, coherence, which is okay. Temperature turned out to be low on a pretty regular basis. Skin conductivity should be stable. Peripheral circulation, hers is extremely low. Then we're seeing a spectral display. So we have the very low, low, and high frequency of her heart rate variability. So one of the things that caught my attention right away was her heart rate variability is much too high for her demographic. And so as I looked into it, we see that her heart is beating, that it isn't being well paced by her system. And so as we talked about earlier, this is one of those things that is a factor that leads to poor health. And statistically, we would even say, suboptimal longevity is because her system isn't being regulated to a homeostatic state. Her heart beating tends to be way too fast and is changing gears far too often for what the environmental demand is. Her heart doesn't need to be working that hard.
Well, you'd expect her, to your point, if she was just sitting in that chair, maybe her heart rate would run at 65 or 70 or something like that, being there with a cap on and all that.
Yep.
But instead, you were seeing it jump up to 95 or close to 100 and then back down to 60. And so the variation in what was happening was just, sort of inappropriate, if you will, to the context in which she found herself, right?
Correct.
So, yeah.
Correct. And then, and so now we're looking at data here that is from 4 sessions in, And what we see is her heart rate variability has now normalized. And, yes, we could say objectively it's low on a health index, like this is
Yeah.
a low, but it's accurate now. Her heart is beginning to be paced, and that's the main thing for her we needed to restore was first get her heart reconnected so it's being paced. Then we can start training her heart rate variability to move to a more optimum state, but we couldn't do that when it was off running on its own.
So this is an interesting point. So we tend to think of high heart rate variability as being a good thing and low heart rate variability as being a bad thing, because high heart rate variability typically is associated with high parasympathetic nervous system tone, and low heart rate variabilities associated with high sympathetic nervous system tone or more stress.
Correct.
But in this case, she had high heart rate variability, not because she had a lot of parasympathetic nervous system tone, but because the heart rate was just kind of unhinged from what was going on with her respiratory rate. And so it was indicative of another problem. So, everybody's used to looking at their Whoop and Oura Ring and Garmin and Apple Watch and see what their heart rate variability is. And some people will say, well, mine's, really high. And it's like, one of the first things we have to question is it appropriately high, right? Not just, oh, that's great, congratulations, because it could be great, but maybe it's inappropriately high.
Right.
So it's kind of looking under the hood a little further. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's exactly what happened in her case. Whenever we would mention Autonomics, she'd be like, oh, I've got my wearable, I'll leave the name out. And, it says my HRV is really high and my recovery is good. And then when we looked at it, with clinic level equipment where we could break the components out, we saw this finding. And that was what ultimately led to a treatment plan that was successful and allowed her to break free of her chronic depression.
Well, it was interesting. When we were talking about this before, you kind of started treating her initially for her depression, right? Which is what she presented with. And she'd been treated for, I don't know how many different years. But to your credit, I think when you started to see this disconnect between her heart rate and heart rate variability, that didn't really correlate with depression either, so to speak. And it raised the question in your mind, I think, of did she have a traumatic brain injury? Was there something in the past that we didn't know about? So
yes. Yep. So the finding in her EEG that had some markers of TBI, although in her health report she denied any TBI. So we set the TBI findings aside. That's not uncommon for the report to show some metrics and the person not to have a history, and we set it aside. But in her case, all of those factors coming together, she's not moving in a typical fashion given the treatment. We look at her autonomics. Her autonomics are off in a way that you might make you think TBI. That revisited the TBI metric that said there was a TBI. She brought forward the story of when she was 13 and fell on the ice and cracked her head open. But, today we could all kind of go, yeah, that's probably a TBI. That counts.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But at the time, it was a Band-Aid and some ice cream and away you go. Right. So there was no treatment. It went on. But it also marked the point for her of this transition. And we know from TBIs, one of the very common things that's impacted is the autonomic nervous system. But along with that, I think they can be separated, but they often go together, which is the endocrine system.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a TBI and it knocks your endocrine system off, it knocks your autonomic nervous system off. You're kind of set up for a version of what her next 30 years look like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those two systems are interrelated also. Quite honestly.
Exactly. And so, like trying to parse, was it a endocrine issue or was it a autonomic nervous system issue, as if it could be siloed, they're interrelated and so academic to pull it apart. But her health history indicates, problems in both. And so training her in biofeedback and getting autonomic nervous system to recalibrate and bringing in the coordination of her cardiac rhythm, her respiratory rhythm, and her baroreflex. So getting those three metrics to kind of line up and then train that. And, I kind of laugh at these. So after one of the sessions, she said, I had this really weird experience. And she starts to describe the experience. It was like this. And she's kind of concerned, not overly concerned. She's not a dramatic person, but kind of framing it in a, like, is something wrong? And, and I just smiled. I said, what you're describing is the feeling of relaxation.
There you go.
And
There you go.
she had just never
Yeah.
encountered it before.
Right.
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 And
Yeah.
she'd
That
been
chronic
in
sort of, stress. Yeah. I get it.
chronic stress, chronic hypervigilance,
Mm-hmm.
and encountering, just flirting with a state of regulation and
Right.
at ease
Mm-hmm.
was foreign. Like and so,
Right.
and we see this, I'm sure you see it too, is people, again, it's that they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And if people have never been, or it's been so long since they have been regulated,
That's right.
it's like foreign territory.